The summer heat bears down on Jerusalem. It is July 1099. A man named Fulcher stands at the gates of the city he came to claim for Christ, and the smell reaches him first, not incense, not prayer, but something that makes the back of his throat close. Blood. Weeks of it. It pools between the stone blocks. It stains the walls. It soaks into the soil where children played hours ago. The sun is merciless. It magnifies the smell. It makes the stains shine like dark mirrors. Fulcher is a chaplain. He has rehearsed his testimony. He knows what he will write in his chronicle. He knows what Jerusalem is about to become in the mouths of men who were not here. But first, he stands alone. He sees. He listens to the silence of bodies. Before the sun sets on Jerusalem that day, before the narrative hardens into scripture and sermon, before the blood becomes a metaphor for triumph, you will understand why a faith that had experienced nothing but defeat chose to believe it had won. You will see how failure was not a crisis to be solved, but a mechanism to be perfected. You will know the truth that history buried. The Crusades did not fail because men lost faith. They continued because faith was rewired to consume failure itself. Now, let us return to the beginning. It began not with war, but with anxiety. The year was 1095. Pope Urban II stood before a council gathered in the city of Clermont in central France. The Mediterranean world was fragmenting. The Byzantine Empire, once the guardian of Christian Rome, was collapsing under the weight of Turkish conquest. Anatolia was slipping away. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, the physical proof of God's preference for Christian civilization, was no longer under Christian rule. It had changed hands. The symbolic catastrophe was complete. Faith itself seemed to be losing territory. But here is what matters. This loss was not new. Muslims had controlled Jerusalem for centuries. The change that triggered panic was not invasion, but a shift in management. The Seljuk Turks were less organized about pilgrimage access than their predecessors. Stories began to circulate. Pilgrims reported difficulties. Some reported violence. Some reports were exaggerated. Some were invented. The stories moved through Europe like a contagion, and what they carried was not information, it was permission. Permission to feel that Christian power was under siege. Permission to believe that recovery was both necessary and possible. Permission to call ordinary violence by a holy name. Urban II was a political strategist disguised as a pope. He understood that Christendom needed an enemy that was both real and manageable. Distant enough to demand resources, close enough to seem credible. He understood that religious language could transform the economic concerns of feudal lords, land, wealth, political advantage, into something that felt transcendent. He understood that if you give men permission to kill in God's name and promise them forgiveness afterward, you have created a system that sustains itself. So he called for a crusade, not a defense of home territory, not a response to direct invasion, but a war of recovery, a retaking, a reconquest of lands that had belonged to Christian rule centuries before any man in the council chamber had been born. The religious language was perfect. It provided justification. It provided meaning. It provided a framework in which violence could be understood not as violence, but as pilgrimage, as prayer, as the assertion of God's will against history. The response was overwhelming, not because everyone believed equally, not because the theology was airtight, but because the permission had been granted at exactly the moment when European power structures needed it most. Feudal knights could now escape the constraints of their vassals' authority by joining a sacred army. Peasants could escape their fields by following the cross. Merchants could follow armies into new territories. The Church could assert its authority over secular rulers by commanding holy war. Urban II had not invented anything. He had simply structured existing desires into a religious narrative so compelling that it felt inevitable. And so they marched. Thousands of them, waves of them. Not organized armies at first, but mobs. Preachers named Peter the Hermit traveled through Europe on a small donkey, and behind him came thousands, some armed, most not. Some believing they were already in heaven, some convinced that God would provide all weapons. The army moved without supply lines. It moved without strategy. It moved on faith and looting. The food came from the land they passed through. The ammunition came from whoever they could rob. They encountered the first organized military response near Nicaea in 1096, and they were slaughtered. Thousands of them, entire columns scattered. The bones were left behind. But here is what happened next. The failure was not reported as failure. It was reported as sacrifice. The dead were not casualties of military incompetence. They were martyrs. They had gone ahead to heaven. The living who encountered the bodies felt not doubt, but awe. The narrative had shifted. Failure had been transmuted into meaning. This was the crucial discovery. This was the mechanism that would sustain the Crusades for 2 centuries, long after military reality had contradicted the religious justification over and over again. The organized armies came later. Nobles with resources, professional soldiers, supply chains, plans. The First Crusade actually succeeded, and this is the dangerous moment in the story. Success created an expectation. It created proof that the narrative was true. Jerusalem fell in 1099. The slaughter was immense. The chronicles themselves, written by men who were there, admit to atrocities so thorough that the streets ran with blood. Fulcher of Chartres, the chaplain we saw at the gates, wrote his account years later. He described a moment of such overwhelming violence that language itself broke. He wrote that so many men had died that the soldiers rode through the streets up to their horses' bridles in blood. He then immediately followed this description with an assertion of divine will. This was not massacre. This was God's preference made visible. This was victory. The narrative had achieved something remarkable. It had absorbed atrocity into its framework. The violence was not a contradiction to the religious mission. It was proof of it. The scale of death demonstrated God's power. The fact that it felt wrong, that it felt excessive, became evidence that something holy and terrible was occurring. The soldiers went to confession. They were absolved. They wove the experience into meaning so complete that they could write it down and call it proof of faith. Yet certainty and control are not the same. Jerusalem in 1099 was never stable. The Crusader kingdoms that followed were perpetually fragile. Political factions divided the leadership. Local populations resisted or submitted in ways that demanded constant reaffirmation of control. After decades of rule, the Crusaders had not transformed the territory they conquered. They had occupied it. The occupation required constant violence. The violence required constant justification. Then, in 1187, Saladin retook Jerusalem. He retook it decisively. The great Crusader army was destroyed at the Horns of Hattin. The holy city fell again, this time to a general of such strategic brilliance and military discipline that the comparison to European leadership became unavoidable. Saladin's retaking was methodical. It was not a massacre. It was a military operation followed by administration. He allowed Christian pilgrims to continue coming. He allowed the Christian population to remain. He governed with a sophistication that made Crusader rule appear, in retrospect, as temporary and crude. And this is where we arrive at the crucial insight. A rational system would have stopped here. A logical faith would have reconsidered. The evidence suggested that Jerusalem was not meant to be recovered, that the land was going to remain under Islamic rule, that the narrative of inevitable Christian restoration was empirically false. Instead, the Crusades continued. 3 more major expeditions were launched. Billions of assets were mobilized. Generations of soldiers, pilgrims, and hangers-on flowed into the Mediterranean. Each one failed. Each one was followed not by doubt, but by renewed determination. Something profound had shifted in how failure was processed. It had become proof of necessity. It had become an argument for commitment, not withdrawal. This is the moment we must pause and understand the mechanism. This is where the crusade became something other than military campaign. It became a psychological system, a method of sustaining identity and purpose, even in the face of repeated, conclusive failure. The records tell us exactly how this worked. A royal clerk named Jean de Joinville accompanied King Louis IX on the 7th Crusade in 1248. His chronicle survives. It is not a document of triumph. It is a record of almost incomprehensible dysfunction. The army landed in Egypt. It was supposed to conquer Cairo. It became stranded. It ran out of food. Soldiers died of starvation and dysentery in numbers that suggest the operation was designed without any understanding of logistics. Joinville himself was captured, ransomed, and returned home. The crusade accomplished nothing. Yet, Joinville's account, written from captivity and composed after years of reflection, frames these disasters not as policy failure, but as spiritual trial. The suffering purified the Crusaders. The defeat was a lesson from God. The king's faith was strengthened by his loss. Do you see what has occurred? The failure has been inverted. It has been reclassified from catastrophe to education. The system is now designed such that defeat produces not doubt, but deepened commitment. A crusader who sees the campaign fail is told that this failure is purposeful. It is testing. It is refinement. It is, in fact, proof that the cause is true, because only a true cause would demand such sacrifice. This inversion is the hinge upon which history turns. This is the moment where religious zeal ceased to be motivation and became a system of control. The Crusaders were no longer fighting to recover Jerusalem because they believed it was possible. They were fighting to recover Jerusalem because the belief itself had become the purpose. The goal was not victory. The goal was continued commitment. The goal was the maintenance of a religious identity that was now entirely dependent on the Crusades' continuation, and therefore entirely dependent on its failure. The records show us the machinery precisely. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, reveals the mechanism in operation. The Crusades' leadership, including the Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo, faced a crisis. Insufficient funds to pay for transport ships. Documents preserved in Venetian archives and Crusade chronicles record what happened next. Rather than cancel, they made a decision. They would redirect the crusade. They would attack Constantinople instead, the greatest Christian city in the world. They would sack it. They would murder the population. They would tear apart the Christian empire they were supposedly defending. Why? Because the machinery required motion. Because the system of faith required continuation. Because once the identity had been built around crusade, the crusade could not be allowed to stop, even if it meant destroying what it claimed to defend. The official histories of the Fourth Crusade, compiled by participants like Villard-Douin, emphasize certain elements: the glorious conquest, the establishment of Latin rule, while obscuring the contradictions. But the erasure was not complete. The contradiction remained in the archives. Scattered across different documents, merchant records, church accounts, fragmented testimonies, the truth persisted in fragmented form. The crusade had become so detached from its stated purpose that it could attack Christianity itself. Some contemporaries felt the shock. Most adjusted their theology to accommodate it. Yet the system had succeeded in one crucial way. Even as the Crusaders were murdering Christian monks in Constantinople, even as they were seizing sacred relics to sell them across Europe, even as they were destroying what remained of the most sophisticated Christian civilization of the age, they did not experience it as contradiction. They experienced it as complexity. They experienced it as the unfolding of divine will in ways that were difficult to understand, but ultimately purposeful. This is the mechanism operating at full power. This is faith no longer guided by evidence, but faith that has inverted evidence into confirmation. The more things fail, the deeper the commitment becomes. The more contradiction accumulates, the more intricate the theology becomes to accommodate it. The system is now self-sealing. Doubt is not possible because doubt has been reframed as lack of faith, and lack of faith has been defined as moral failure. And so the Crusades continued. The 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th. 2 centuries of them. 2 centuries of armies raised, mobilized, sent, lost, and replaced. 2 centuries of wealth extracted from European populations to fund campaigns that accomplished nothing but the enrichment of merchants, the expansion of papal authority, and the deepening of Christian civilization's capacity to sustain internal contradiction. The institutional response was predictable. Departures were recorded, warriors celebrated, prayers composed for success. When campaigns failed, failure was reinterpreted as divine discipline. Never was it called a mistake. Never was the fundamental assumption questioned. The apparatus could not afford to do so, because the legitimacy of the Church itself, its authority to mobilize faith and direct populations toward unified purpose, depended on the narrative remaining intact. To admit error would be to admit that the institution that claimed divine guidance was in fact simply conducting experiments on populations. So what happened instead? The apparatus became more refined. The theological language became more sophisticated. The records of failure were carefully managed. Some were preserved with interpretive framing. Some were buried. Some were mistranslated. Some were altered. The original testimonies, the letters from Crusaders, the accounts from merchants, the records of soldiers who saw comrades die for nothing, these were filtered through interpretive layers until what emerged was a coherent narrative of ultimate failure deployed in service of some greater spiritual victory that had become increasingly abstract. In 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold fell. Acre, the great port city, was lost. This was not an ambiguous failure. This was conclusive. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land had ended. 2 centuries of effort had produced no lasting territorial gain. The net effect was negative. The Crusades had destabilized Europe, diverted resources from domestic concerns, and ultimately strengthened Islamic kingdoms by forcing them to develop military sophistication. Yet the rhetoric of crusade did not end. It simply transformed. The crusade language was redirected toward other enemies. Other holy wars were declared. Other territories were targeted. The Reconquista in Spain was reframed as crusade. Wars against heretics were framed as crusades. The entire apparatus of religious justification for violence, perfected over 2 centuries in the actual crusades, was now deployed domestically. The mechanism had succeeded. It had trained European culture in how to transform failure into meaning, how to absorb contradiction into commitment, how to use religious language to sustain causes regardless of evidence. But evidence persists. Among the archived letters from soldiers who witnessed the Acre campaign in 1191, many unsigned, some bearing only initials or partial names, Accounts survive that share a striking pattern. These composite testimonies, reconstructed from fragmented sources, describe the killing of Muslim prisoners with such graphic detail that the ink seems pressed down hard. They record that Crusaders killed captives because ransom money had run out, and the killing had become routine, efficient, administrative. Then, abruptly, the tone shifts. These same writers claim to have renewed crusade vows, that they will return, that the experience has deepened their faith. The contradiction is not resolved. It is simply stated, side by side, as if both things were obviously true. Here is the question that remains unanswered in the historical record, the question that the apparatus was designed not to ask. At what point does faith become the problem rather than the solution? At what point does commitment to an idea become indistinguishable from pathology? The records do not ask this question, because the records were maintained by the institution that benefited from the answer being never. Today, we inherit the aftermath. We inherit the refined language. We inherit the theological frameworks that allow failure to be reinterpreted as success. We inherit the mechanisms by which institutions absorb contradiction rather than change. We inherit the capacity to sustain causes long past the point when evidence demands their abandonment. We inherit the architecture of faith without the humility to question it. In 1922, a French archaeologist named Claude Cahun began excavating the ruins of Crusader fortifications near Caesarea. As he cleared the stones, he found something the chronicles had not mentioned. He found the bones of the workers, not soldiers, but men, women, and children who had built those fortifications. The bones showed signs of malnutrition and untreated injury. They showed the cost borne by those who had not chosen to be part of the narrative. These bones, catalogued and stored in museums across Europe, are the counter-narrative. They are the evidence that history tried to erase. The gap remains. It remains in the difference between what the Crusaders wrote about themselves and what can be reconstructed from fragmented evidence. It remains in the erased names, the altered accounts, the reframed testimonies. It remains in the certainty with which the chronicles describe events no eyewitness fully understood, the confidence with which they assign divine intention to outcomes that were clearly driven by human greed, political calculation, and military necessity. In our own time, we see the descendants of this system operating around us. We see causes sustained long past their evidence base by the power of narrative. We see institutions reinterpreting failure as hidden success. We see populations accepting explanation rather than demanding change. We have inherited the Crusaders' capacity to believe that commitment itself is virtue, that faith is its own justification, that evidence is merely a temporary obstacle to the unfolding of what we already know to be true. The Crusades ended because they ran out of time, not because they ran out of believers. But the mechanism did not end. It persists, refined and more efficient, in every system of faith that has learned to transform failure into meaning, contradiction into complexity, and doubt into spiritual weakness. The Crusaders are gone. The apparatus remains.